Local programming on KRWG made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Welcome to Fronteras, a Changing America. I'm Edmundo Resendez. Our guest is Ms. Nancy Oretskin, who co-founded the Southwest Asylum and Migration Institute, otherwise known as SAMI, in 2013. The Southwest Asylum and Migration Institute was created in 2013 to provide low-cost and, at times, pro bono immigration legal services. The main focus of SAMI's activities is aimed at representing those fleeing persecution and violence in their own country. First, let's take a look at an educational program in Omaha, Nebraska that works to improve the lives of political refugees coming to the U.S. to escape violence.
Founded in January of 2011, the Benson Area Refugee Task Force Board was created to better the lives of refugees in Omaha.
Our students are refugees primarily from Asia, Bhutan, Nepal, Burma, various countries where they've been persecuted by their governments, and they're coming to America to live life freely without fear of their government trying to murder them, essentially.
I live in Bhutan after I came to Nepal in 1991. So I lived there 21 years. After 21 years, I came here in United States. So I came here 2014.
I'm from Burma and I'm a refugee of my country, left to United States because the Burmas we have a lot of civil wars. We have fighting and we have many different ethnics, and with the Burma government is so bad. Then we left our country. Now I speak Burmese and Korean, a little bit English. I know myself. I don't have school. I never go school here. Then I never go school, and I just study ESA class where I have my opportunity.
The BART program makes the change from their home country to America a little bit easier.
This is Maya David
and Isabella Manhart,
reporting from Lewiston Park Middle School in Omaha, Nebraska.
Welcome to Fronteras, a Changing America. I'm Edmundo Resendez. Our guest today is Ms. Nancy Oretskin, who is not only an attorney, an immigration attorney, but is also a professor at New Mexico State University. And Professor Oretskin, how do you do it? You are a busy person. From what I hear on the weekends, your car is parked outside your office. And your office is your second home.
Well, kind of. Very often, though, my car is not parked outside my NMSU office because it's parked in the parking lot of a detention center.
So how did you first become involved, or what caused you to become involved in immigration cases, in particular refugee cases?
I have to give a call out to Miss Molly Malloy, who's the legal librarian at, she's the librarian at New Mexico State, and her expertise is Latin America. In 2007, she started to count the people that were being killed as a result of the violence that was ticking up in Mexico. People started fleeing to the U.S., a number of them seeking asylum. And she contacted me and said, why aren't you involved in this? Because we had done some legal work before, and as a result of Molly, I met an attorney and I started to self-educate, and as a result, I founded SAMI.
Let's talk about SAMI. What is the purpose of SAMI?
So SAMI is a not-for-profit organization where it's primarily me at the moment, but I use a lot of NMSU volunteers to help me do translations, and I co-counsel cases. I provide legal representation primarily for people seeking asylum. And let me just be clear of what asylum is, because people get confused between asylum and amnesty. Okay, amnesty was what President Reagan provided in the 80s, and that was a program for people that were in the country undocumented to correct or pay a fee and get on a path to legal status. Asylum is a completely different process. It's recognized in international law and under the UN, and essentially when someone is seeking asylum, they are a refugee fleeing violence in their home country. The difference...
Let me add to that, because let's be clear about something. There's also a difference between asylum and actual refugees.
So refugees are someone who is outside the U.S. So there is a process through the UN and through the U.S. where you can be vetted and approved to enter the U.S. as a refugee. And for example, in preparation for this show, I looked up some current statistics, and the U.S. admitted 84,995 refugees in the fiscal year ending September 2016. Just to put that in perspective, the European Union, including Norway and Switzerland, admitted 1.3 million refugees. Our newly elected President Trump, as you all know, has passed some executive orders banning refugees from coming into the U.S., and currently, last I knew, all of his bans had been stayed by a court. The difference with a refugee and an asylee, if somebody goes to a port of entry to the U.S. and doesn't have a visa to enter and expresses fear, it's called credible fear, and says, if I'm returned to my home country, I'll be killed. Under our obligation in international law, the U.S. is obligated to admit these people and not admit, to transfer these people to a detention center in the U.S. and give them a credible fear interview to see if they can proceed to argue their asylum case before an immigration judge. So a refugee is determined outside the U.S. to be admitted. An asylee is somebody who goes to the U.S. and is inside the U.S. asking to be recognized as a refugee.
Let's look at the last 10 years, just to start out the conversation. In the last 10 years, where are we with regards to asylum seekers? You know, I know that I heard, in particular regarding Mexico, that people were trying to become asylum seekers but were being denied.
Okay, so I'm not really up to date on actual numbers and statistics, so we can talk just generally. Okay, the violence in Mexico actually started to tick up in, I think, 2007, where thousands of people were being murdered in various places in Mexico. And I'm not going to weigh in on what caused that violence, because there's different theories. There's different theories it was cartel violence. There's different theories it was the Mexican military. There's different theories the Mexican government was involved. I'm not an expert in that. All I know is there were a lot of brutal murders in the state of Chihuahua, and many people fled to the U.S. border seeking asylum. Many of those claims, probably more than 95% of those claims, have been denied.
Okay, let's stop there. 95%. How, again, because they are asylum seekers, why is that number so high?
Well, we do have a law in the U.S., and you hear a lot of talk about immigration reform, but we currently do have an immigration law, and it's also recognized under the UN. There's a definition of what somebody needs to legally prove in order to win an asylum case. And just speaking generally, I'm not speaking specifically as a lawyer, there's actually 3 parts to this legal test. The first is somebody has to prove that they're persecuted. And persecuted is not a defined term, but raped, murdered, beat up, that's persecution. If you yourself haven't been persecuted, but you believe you have a well-founded fear of future persecution, your family member was killed, you were threatened, that will work. So it's either persecution or a well-founded fear of persecution. That's one, and you have to prove that. Two, you have to prove it's by the government. Okay?
By the government, not
by the government. So in Mexico, there's been no actual proof that the violence is caused by the government. Cartels are not the government. They're a criminal organization. And those, it's very difficult to prove that although many people believe that some cartels are intertwined in the government, both in the US and Mexico, there's no direct proof that the judges accept. So right there is a difficult issue to prove or to win a Mexican asylum case. The other issue is if you're being threatened by the cartel, very rarely do you go to the police. You don't have a police report. And that's a criteria, so they say, well, how can the government help you when you didn't go to tell the government you were being persecuted, which is a difficult aspect in many cases. So you have to prove that the persecution is by the government, but then you have to prove you're in a particular class. So your persecution by the government is on account of race, religion, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. Many people are familiar with asylum as political asylum, but that's only one aspect of asylum. And then the third piece is country relocation. You have to prove that you tried to relocate somewhere in the country and you weren't able to do so. So back to your question on Mexico. Many people that live in Sonora or Chihuahua, and for those that aren't familiar with that, those are the states right below New Mexico, Texas, and Arizona. They don't try to relocate anywhere in Mexico, they flee to the US. So even if they can prove persecution, and even if they're able to prove that the government either knew or should have known, they didn't try to relocate. And there's a legal burden that you can say, well, I couldn't relocate because there's checkpoints everywhere, or I had to register my social security number with the bank and they would know. You have to prove you tried to do that. And if you can, then you prove there's no relocation, and possibly you could win a case.
Let's stay with the Americas for now, because SAMI covers cases from Ghana, Zimbabwe, Nigeria, Syria, Somalia, in addition to El Salvador. But how does this work with Central Americans that are fleeing from gang violence?
Okay, when you say how does it work,
I mean, again, they're not necessarily escaping government persecution, but they're trying to escape the gang violence that's so prevalent in El Salvador, Guatemala, and these countries.
And many are sent back, and I'm going to tell you a heart-wrenching story right now of a woman I represent who's in a detention center right now today. This woman is 22 years old. She's a very attractive woman. She fled cartel threats in 2012, went to McAllen, Texas, had a credible fear interview and failed, had a negative finding, and was returned back to her little town in El Salvador. She fled again and was picked up in McAllen and then received what's called a final order of removal and sent back to El Salvador. In January of 2015, she was actually raped in the middle of the day by the same gang member who threatened her, and she fled again, and she's in detention right now. She was first represented by the federal public defender, who had her illegal re-entry, that is typically considered a felony, reduced to a misdemeanor. And then she contacted me, and I picked up her asylum case, and she was determined to have a negative credible fear finding, so they were going to send her back to El Salvador, but I intervened and got her to sign a piece of paper that she gets to go before a judge to see if he'll overturn this decision. those decisions are affirmed 99% of the time. But just to let you know how awful the little town that this woman is from, a friend, Molly Malloy actually, knew an attorney, a U.S. attorney that lived in this little town in El Salvador. He submitted an affidavit attesting to the lawlessness in this little area because it's being run by a gang, submitted an affidavit that we submitted to the judge, and now we're waiting to hear whether she'll be able to proceed with her asylum case or be deported again.
All right, let's talk about the process then. I mean, what's the process for somebody that's looking to seek asylum? They come in, declare they're seeking asylum. What happens next? I mean, who do they talk to? Are there people that are experts in what's happening in these countries to ask the right questions and to have a better understanding of what's going on?
Okay, so I'm just going to take that apart. I can't speak for who's in El Salvador. I don't know what experts there are. I can only speak from the U.S. end. And I need to clarify something. There are some people that come into the U.S. with a visitor's visa, and then when they're in the U.S. request asylum. That's a different process than if you don't have a visa and you go to the border. Because if you go to the border and request credible fear, more likely than not, you're going to be put in detention. And your case process is much quicker, and it's very difficult for you to get documents because you're held in detention, which is supposed to be civil detention, but it's like a criminal detention. So there's two different ways to get asylum. One is affirmative. We're focusing mostly on defensive because that's where I spend a lot of my time representing people that are in detention. Are there experts? No, there aren't experts. And as people know, many of the gangs in El Salvador and Guatemala and Honduras were people that were deported from the U.S. There is a lot of documents and facts showing that these gangs were in, criminal prisons in Texas and California and deported. And so the U.S., in my view, has a little bit of responsibility to deal with that violence. And I believe the U.S. is attempting. I'm not going to say. I mean, by providing funding to train people to combat the criminal gangs and whatever, but they certainly aren't cutting any of these people who are claiming credible fear any kind of deal right now. Back in the 80s, when there was another crisis, they were given some limited protected ability to stay here for a little while to work, but they were never put on a path to citizenship. So this gets complicated, and I don't want to take you off the track.
Well, let's paint a picture.
Okay.
Somebody from Nigeria, Zimbabwe, you've dealt in these cases, wants to seek asylum in this country. They come in wanting asylum. What's the process? Do they face a judge? Are they immediately assigned an attorney, an expert that can guide them in this process? And are they treated differently if they come in through Texas, through California? What happens?
Okay, so there's a lot of parts to that question, all right? So first of all, you ask yourself, like, how did Sammy, first of all, located here in Las Cruces, New Mexico, represent Africans? Okay, I got a phone call from the detention center from 3 Africans, and I thought it was my friends making a prank call.
Because, in my assumption, I expect for the phone calls to come in English, in Spanish, primarily, but you're dealing with cases literally from around the world.
Right, because people that enter in one of the 7 border crossings on the southern border, okay, come from around the world. So let me try to answer the question you asked. The Africans, how did they get here? There's civil wars in many African countries. There is corrupt governments. And so I'm going to focus on 3 countries, Nigeria, Ghana, Somalia, of course, Zimbabwe, because I've just represented people from those countries. How did they get to the border? Many of them got to Brazil somehow, either flew or took a bus or got there, and then they traveled on land. So from Brazil, they crossed the Darien Gap into Colombia, and then they traveled on land in groups at different times and got to Mexico, typically southern Mexico, and then they either took a bus or hopped the train and they got to either Texas or California. They don't know the difference. So first of all, somebody in an immigration proceeding is not entitled to free legal counsel. That's different than a criminal proceeding where you are given a public defender. So let me answer that. Is there a difference whether somebody comes into the country from Texas versus California? There's a huge difference because in the US we have different circuit courts. Texas is in the 5th Circuit, and it's one of the most conservative circuits and has one of the highest denial rates for asylum. And California is the 9th Circuit and has one of the largest number of grants of asylum. But somebody from some little town in Nigeria or a little town, Plumtree, Zimbabwe, knows the United States. They don't know the difference, and they buy the cheapest bus ticket to get to the border. And once they're in a detention center, they are then held to that circuit court's legal decisions. It's important to clear up a few things for people. These immigration judges are not constitutional courts. When you've heard a lot of debate recently about the new Supreme Court justice, that's a constitutional court. Immigration courts are housed within the Department of Homeland Security, and they're administrative law courts. So they are not handled in the same way that a trial court is handled pursuant to the Constitution. Did I answer all of your questions?
Yes,
Some of
but
them?
it leads to so many questions because, again, you know, if somebody calls you, they've been detained in Texas, and the deniability is so high, what other resources do they have besides SAMI?
Well, there are law firms that take some asylum cases. There are some other organizations. There's Las Americas, which is an organization in El Paso. There's other not-for-profit organizations in Texas I'm unfamiliar with. But the vast majority of asylum seekers in detention in El Paso that have no money and represent themselves, because you can always represent yourself pro se, 99% lose their cases. But let me be clear, within the Texas immigration, within El Paso, there are 6 immigration judges. Before the show started, I was sharing some statistics. 5 of the immigration judges that are tracked, because they've done more than 100 asylum cases, have a denial rate in excess of 97%. So that's even with an attorney.
With an attorney, it's 97%.
Without an attorney, it's like
99%.
99.9% that people lose their asylum cases. So they come here, they're held in detention. Some are held in detention well over a year. And just for the taxpayers who are watching, it's $167 a day to keep somebody in a civil detention center, of which many of them are private enterprises that the government pays. And after a year or so, they're deported back to their country, provided their country will provide travel documents.
Okay, so if somebody comes in seeking asylum, they're denied that asylum, or in the process, they're held in detention. They're not set free with a court date.
More likely than not, the large percentage are held in detention. If a family comes, father, mother, and some kids, in the El Paso area, we don't have the capacity to detain families. And if families can prove they're not a flight risk and they have relatives in the El Paso area, they may parole in the mother and the child, but they'll detain the father. And so they're both in defensive asylum proceedings, but the timeline is different. If you're in detention, your asylum case typically is held within 60 to 120 days of your detention, maybe a little longer. If you're out of detention and referred to a court, the court is just setting cases now for the year 2020. So there's a big push to get out on parole. And prior to President Trump, some people were able to get out of detention on parole, but he signed an executive order denying people to be considered for parole, that they need to have their detention, they need to have their asylum case heard.
Professor Oretskin, what drives you to do this?
There's a lot
Given the success rate that exists, 97%, what drives you to do this?
My family were a bunch of immigrants that came in through Ellis Island in Russia. My father fought in the Second World War, and he was on Omaha Beach during D-Day. And I think we as Americans owe an obligation to people fleeing violence to try to help them win their cases. And I'm in a position where I have a support from New Mexico State, and I'm able to provide my legal expertise to those few cases I can win.
Professor Oretskin, I want to thank you very much for being here. We could go on for a long time having this discussion, but thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on Fronteras, a Changing America. I'm Edmundo Resendez.